I'm not a talk therapy person, and I've been told I probably should do it, but I just don't do it because I feel like my problems aren't as like bad, quote, quote, or worrisome as some people who are more traumatized because I do have that outlet. So I don't do talk therapy, but a lot of people do find really good outcomes and realizations out of it. And, people who don't want to do it or don't want it on their record or whatever, like journal, like do some meditation, journal it out, write it out, work out, or like there's so many other ways to do it. And maybe try talk therapy and who knows, maybe you will enjoy it. But I was just never that person because, my family when we were younger had to go through a lot of therapy and I just never felt like my issues were big enough to be talked about. So it was just always for me, I just never felt like that.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast of military and veterans who refuse to be silenced. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, provide value and solutions, and to change the culture when it comes to mental health within the DoD organizations. Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming back for another episode of Your Story Doesn't End Here. Today's guest is Brittinie Wick, who is an Air Force veteran, health and fitness coach, MBA graduate, and aspiring sports physical therapist. She served 8 years as an intel analyst at Ramstein and Creech Air Force Base. Her military experience has profoundly shaped her approach to health and fitness, emphasizing the importance of holistic well-being and mental strength. She is also the host of the podcast Women Serve Too, which I was a guest on, which amplifies the voices of military women and veterans. Brittinie, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And before we get into the episode, if there's one word or a few words you could use to describe how you are feeling today going into this recording, how would you describe that?
Oh, now I'm feeling put on the spot. So I wasn't expecting that
I know,
question.
I threw you off.
But overall, I feel great. Yeah, I'm excited.
It's basically a long-winded way of saying, how are you today? But it requires more deep thought. So that's that.
Okay.
But,
All right.
and the reason why I ask it is because I think that it kind of sets the tone for the episode because some people are more emotional going in. Some people are like really excited. Most people are excited. But anyway, just kind of a off the wall
I
question.
no, I was thrown off because I was like, "Oh, I'm ready to tell my story." But I mean, I'm excited. It's not very often that I'm the guest of, the podcast. Like I'm always the host.
Yeah.
So it is exciting to kind of be on the opposite end, if you will.
Yeah, it's a little awkward for me to be on other people's podcasts sometimes because, like I said, everyone does it so differently. So,
That is very true.
um, mine are a little less structured. Mine are just very go with the flow. So, that being
I
said,
like that.
I am going to pass it off to you then to share your story with the listeners.
All right. Well, yeah. So my military journey started right after high school. I will say though, like as corny as this sounds, have you ever watched Cadet Kelly with Hilary Duff, like back?
Bits and pieces. I don't think I've ever watched the full movie, as embarrassing as it is, because I love Hilary Duff.
Yeah, like I'm talking like this was probably like 2004, 2005. Like, so people born at like early, they probably definitely have no idea what I'm talking about. But anyway, so, I was probably in middle school and I watched this movie, Cadet Kelly, on Disney Channel. And I was like, oh my God, that just seems so badass. So I called my uncle, I think either that day or the next day, and he was, in the Army Reserves. And I was like, I want to join the military. And he was like, are you being serious? And I was like, yeah, like I want to join. And so he kind of always kind of guided me in a way. And so he was Army. So I was like, I'm going to go Army, but I want to go reserves because I still want to go to school. And, throughout my whole high school journey, if you will. Like everyone's already going to like planning on, post high school journeys. And I was like, well, I'm going into the military. So that was always just like, I just knew I was going to go in. And there was one summer, my dad and because my uncle was his brother, we would take trips, like summer trips along somewhere in the US. And there was one time that we went from Nebraska, where I'm from, to California. And along the way, we stayed at military bases for lodging. And that was the first glimpse of the difference between Army and Air Force. And that's when I was like, okay. And my uncle was like, honestly, Brittany, as your uncle, I probably feel more comfortable with you going Air Force than Army. So I started talking to the Army or the Air Force recruiter. But I was very, very set on, going reserves and not active duty. I was like, no, I want to go to school. Like, I wanted to be a lawyer, which for the record, I'm not. And I didn't go into law school, but that was the journey I thought I was going to go on. So I was like, I am not going to talk to active duty. I would shut them out. I was like, no, I'm going reserves. But, it might have been a blessing in disguise because the Air Force Reserve recruiter, he just like blew me off. I went to his office at Offutt Air Force Base with my grandfather, and we had the talk, da da da. He was gonna call me back, he never did. And I scored really well on the ASVAB, so I got a bunch of calls from all the recruiters from all the branches, and the Air Force one. And I remember it was ironically on my break when I was working at Victoria's Secret, my high school job. So, like, I got a call from the Air Force active duty recruiter, and I blew him off. And he's like, well, why don't you just come in and, we could talk? And I was like, all right, fine. And, everything happens for a reason. And I had a really big argument with my father that weekend. And that's when I was like, fuck it, I'm joining. Like, I want to get the fuck out of this household. So I immediately switched from having the mindset of going reserves to active duty within a weekend. And I went in and I was like, all right, I'll sign. He was like, wait, really? I was like, yeah, like just like, give me, I want Intel. Like, and I was so adamant about Intel for some reason. And I was like, yeah, sign me. And he was like, okay. So then, how I told my dad was he wanted to start an argument with me. And I was like, oh, by the way, I'm leaving for basic training in July. And he was like, wait, what? And I was like, yeah, I signed for the, active duty Air Force. And the whole tone of being at home completely changed afterwards. Like he didn't decide to pick fights or have arguments with me. So I went to basic training in July of 2009, not knowing what I was getting into. And, I went to Goodfellow Air Force Base for tech school. And then my first duty station was Ramstein, where I met my husband. And we met in first term airman's class. So we've been together for like such a long time. So I just get to my new duty station, and within 2 weeks, I met this boy, and I was like, okay. And then it was not a tech school marriage, but it was a pretty close, early Air Force career marriage. But yeah, I did 4 years there. And then I was very, very adamant about getting out and then going to law school. Oh Lord, let me tell you, everything happens for a reason, right? So I was like, no, I'm not going to re-enlist. I'm not going to re-enlist. Well, my husband re-enlists and he gets Minot, North Dakota. Like, why not Minot? And I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, I'm not going to Minot. And so I was like, okay, is there a law school there? And there wasn't. And then I was like, okay, what other jobs are there? And there really wasn't.
It's North
And
Dakota.
I was like, oh my God. And I was like, okay, well, I waited to the very last day. And, I had this chief, he kind of took me under his wing too. And he was like, I'll try to get you, work my way to get you a good assignment if you reenlist. And I was like, all right, there's no other opportunity. If I get out, like, I'm not going to law school, I don't have a job. Like, what am I going to do? So I reenlisted. And it completely changed like us from going from Minot, North Dakota to Las Vegas, Nevada. Granted, I was at Creech, and if anyone has ever been to Creech, is literally a trailer park town. And I wish I was joking. And then my husband got Nellis, which of course was like you had this nice gym and the golf course, and like it was obviously a way better base. But then I did 4 years there. I did apply to the UNLV law school, didn't get in. And then I was like, well, what am I gonna do? Right? That was my only law school option. And then I decided to go the MBA route. And then I got my MBA. So I used my post 9/11, which, if anyone doesn't take advantage of their education benefits, please do. Like, you're just leaving money on the table. Like, even if you're just taking a couple classes, like, you could get that BAH. And so it's just money on the table. So then I got my MBA, trying to figure out my life, had a kid. And then, I officially got out. My husband stayed in, but he commissioned. And I was like, well, I don't, still feeling lost in what I wanted to do in life. And so I decided to really focus on being a health and fitness coach because of some of the things that, I've seen as an Intel analyst and like kind of dealt with like during my service. And I used the gym as my therapy. And so I kind of wanted that to be, the reason why other people went to the gym. Like everyone wants to lose weight, right? Like who doesn't? But just it's so good for like your mental health. And that's what I used. So once I got officially got out, I decided to be this health and fitness coach. And then as my journey continued, like everyone's like, well, I have this injury, I have this injury. And then I was acting like a physical therapist without being paid to be a physical therapist. So, which is why I'm now pursuing, my physical therapy degree. But again, GI Bill, like paying for my master's and now a doctorate, like nothing is coming out of my pocket. So definitely take advantage. But that was kind of a little bit of how I started and where I got to.
It's a very high level version of your story. Before I get into my first question, I just wanted to point out that I love how movies and TV shows were so influential on like the millennial decision making. And it's funny for me because I started when I first went to college. I wanted to go criminology because I
Mm,
watched CSI and I was like, forensic pathology, like
yeah,
that's it. CSI, this is great, like so influential in our lives. And you're like, Cadet Kelly is the reason. And I'm like, why did we make so many life decisions as like fresh out of high school teenagers, realistically still, not
I
adults,
know.
because of a movie? I
I
just think
know.
that's
And for
absolutely
the
wild.
record, like, yeah, for the record, like basic training was nothing like the goddamn movie.
I know.
Like,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
lied to me.
Yeah, yeah, just absolutely wild. I don't think. I mean, there's still probably a level of that today. Probably more like YouTube influential and like
Mm.
Instagram for like today's generation of 18-year-olds. But yeah, CSI Cadet Kelly, no, not at all. But whatever, it is what it is. That anyway. That being said, that had absolutely nothing to do with what I was going to ask you. But I was curious because you talk about this like high level version of your story, and and I think when we look at people's stories from like the outside in, if we're reading a book or hearing a story that someone said, it seems like everything just kind of like fell into place, right? I wanted to
Hmm.
talk more about like the mental health side of things and
Yeah.
like how it really was for you as your like life throws one thing after one thing after one thing at you, right? And it sounds kind of like you made these decisions obviously based off of what life was throwing at you next. It's not like, you had this like roadmap and then everything laid out perfectly for you. And I know for me in those situations when life kind of throws a loophole at you or a roadblock at you or whatever have you, it can be somewhat difficult to deal with. And so I know you said that fitness was like a huge aspect for you mental health wise, but can you talk us a little bit more through the bits and pieces of your story where it was a little more difficult for you
Mhm.
and what that was like for you at that time?
Yeah. So, first off, like I'm a huge believer of everything happens for a reason, and I am a believer in God. So I feel like it was God's way of putting me where I needed to be. And I think that is what kind of helped me push through a lot of moments Because don't get me wrong, I cried. There are so many times I cried and I was like, why is this not working out? Like, why is this like this isn't how it's supposed to be? Like, I should be doing this. And especially when you transition out of the military, sometimes you feel lost because you're like, well, what's next? Like, this door just closed on me. And like, now I feel lost and I feel behind because, everyone at this point has 10 years into their career or 5 years into their career because they went to college. And then here I am trying to figure out what I'm doing next. So it was really hard to kind of figure out what I wanted to do and just kind of, you know, try to go with the flow. And I think, early on in my career, I had like a very big, devastating loss. So I was a intel analyst. We did a lot of missions in the Middle East, working with like the drones and like the surveillance intel aircraft, over in the Middle East. So there was a lot of things that I saw that a lot of normal 18 to 21-year-olds don't normally see. You see beheadings, you see people getting shot up, you see like, and especially for like the missions that we were doing, providing protection for like the troops on ground, you're trying to provide them intel on people trying to come in and attack them. And you're like, okay, here's where they're at. And it's like it's very surreal, right? Like people are like, "Oh, it's just like the playing video games." It's like, no, you're dealing with people's lives at this point and you're seeing things, but yet you can't talk to anyone. You have a security clearance. I know the military is trying to get better with mental health, but like there's still that stigma. And like even if you're like, "Hey, I need to talk to someone because of something that I saw today," like your security clearance could get pulled and then you're out of the job, you're kicked out of the military. And I actually knew someone who, because I'm a huge advocate for mental health, and especially like if you're not doing okay, like and you can't do talk therapy, maybe try going to the gym or trying to find something to help you cope. And that's where I chose the gym because going back to, being an advocate, someone I did work with, he was like, yeah, I went to my leadership and said I needed to talk to someone. He was like, I was fine. I just needed to talk through something. He got kicked out. He lost his security clearance and got kicked out. And then so for me, that was always such a big thing. Like I didn't want like yes, I was dealing with stuff, but it wasn't in my opinion. And looking back at it, I probably should have talked to someone, but I was like, well, it's not that big of a deal. Like I could keep it in. So I tried to use like a different outlet, so I used the gym. And going early on into my career, I think it was 2 years in, one of my friends was shot in the head by an Islamic extremist at Frankfurt Airport. So it wasn't even a deployed situation. He lived like we were in the dorms as airmen, and his room was down the hall for me. So I would see him every single day. Like, and so you don't think that was going to happen at home, technically, like, right? Like it's Germany, but it's home, right? It's not a deployed location. And I remember when the shooting happened, there was reportings about like kind of what happened. They were like, oh, military members were involved. So, but then there was like this bus. So he was like the bus driver that would go from Ramstein to Frankfurt to pick up the people who were about to get deployed or further deployed because people would go to Ramstein and then get onto the C-17 or yeah, C-17s I think they had, and then to forward deploy to Afghanistan, Kuwait, or wherever. So my friend Zach he wasn't even actually supposed to be on that mission. He decided to take it because someone wasn't feeling good or something. So someone else should have been on there. But he went up to Frankfurt. This is Islamic extremist saw this video that poorly portrayed military members like towards like Islamic women and or just to Islam in general. And so he went and specifically targeted military members at the Frankfurt airport. And so two people actually died that day, and someone else, another military member, actually ran up to him to attack the shooter when his gun jammed. So who knows how many people would have potentially been killed on that day. But I just remember I was at work, and when the recordings were coming out, someone was like, "Oh, that looks like the bus from Ramstein." And I was like, "There's no way that's Zach's. Like there it can't be." So I just kind of like pushed it aside, not thinking about it. But then I remember finding out it was him. And I can't tell you how completely devastated and lost like I felt. Like here I am going to work, taking out quote quote these terrorists, but then this person just took out someone that was generally, you know, like was a good friend of mine. So that really hit home, and it was a very dark place. And then, a couple months later, my husband, fiance at the time, got deployed to Afghanistan. And so he was doing missions with the army going around Afghanistan trying to build up the FOBs, and which is forward operating bases for those unfamiliar. But so he was going to these very, very small FOBs around Afghanistan. And there was times like I wouldn't hear anything from him. And I went into work, and I knew of one of the FOBs he was at, and we would get these like intel reportings like, okay, this is what's happening in the area, because a lot of our missions were Afghanistan. And I remember being briefed that the fob that I knew my fiance slash husband was at, there was 6 Americans that got killed that night. And I hadn't heard from him in several days. And I lost it. I was like, after just dealing with the situation with Zach earlier that year, and then having like my fiance in this situation and not hearing from him, I was not good. Like I went to the gym. I immediately turned to my supervisor. I was like, I need to go somewhere. And so I went to the gym, and I just got on the treadmill and I just ran. Like I didn't know how else to process this emotions, because you can't talk to anyone. I can't talk to like I could have talked to like supervisors or whatever, but I couldn't talk to people who were in my close network, like friends and family, because again, security clearance, need to know. And so I went to the gym and I ran. Girl, I told you, when I tell you I ran, that mile was probably like 5 minutes. Like I was just sprinting my freaking ass off, until like I was just calm. And luckily, it wasn't my husband, RMP to the ones that it was, but like it was that moment where I realized how like the gym was going to be my therapy.
Yeah, I think the crazy thing about being a veteran that I don't think really hit me until, I don't know, maybe a year longer after being a veteran is that like every time there's a news report of military members, something happened or like some tragedy, I'm like holding my breath, like, is that someone I know? Because like I still know people that are serving,
Hmm.
and I probably will for a while because I just got out in 2021. I only served 6.5 years, but even like being active duty and like anytime a tragedy happens, like, is it someone that I know? Is it someone that I served with? Is it a close friend? Is it someone that
Hmm.
I saw in passing? Like, there's so many people that we meet in the military, even if it is just for a blip of time, that we connect with in some way, that like those tragedies that from the outside in for people that didn't serve or just like, oh, one or two people, oh, it's the military, they signed up for that. Like I don't think that when I was active I ever really like fully felt like my life was in danger, like especially
Hmm.
when you are serving at like just a home base, right? And yeah,
Hmm.
technically when you're in the military, yes, there are people in the world who don't like you, and like it's always in the back of your mind, but like I wasn't, at least for me, living day to day thinking that like, my life was in danger because of just going out in
Hmm.
public. And so like I get it when you say like, someone was just doing like a routine job thing, like going and driving a bus somewhere, and then all of a sudden you hear that like what? Like it's just not really expected. And so it
Hmm.
kind of throws you off. But then the other thing that really stuck out to me in what you said is working in the intel community. There's such a unique set of challenges that I don't think a lot of people realize. I worked for a reconnaissance squadron And I
Mhm.
remember that there were people who were in the intel sector of that saw the things that you described, right? Like the tragedies that are
Mhm.
happening on the ground, the horrific things that I'm pretty sure your recruiter didn't brief you on when you went into the office of like, hey, this is probably what you're going to see because every job's different.
Mhm.
But how that affects people mentally and how most people aren't talking about it or aren't able to talk about it because either someone can't relate to them or they fear losing their jobs or security clearance or need to know or list your reason here. That is affecting our intel community even today, and not everyone is prepared for that. And
Mhm.
so, kind of an interesting conversation piece that I think if you're listening to this episode and you aren't familiar with that, or maybe you're one of those people that thinks that the only people that struggle with mental health related things in the military are the boots on the ground combat active duty reservists or veterans. I mean, there's a lot more to it, and I
Mhm.
hope that opens people's eyes to like some of the things that the support roles in the military see that are pretty fucked up, honestly. That some people will never experience a day in their life. And then the other piece is that you talk about working out as a coping mechanism, and I think one thing that I have really reflected on probably more recently is that a lot of people, when it comes to mental health, push like talk about it, find someone to talk
Mhm.
about it. I don't think that is the end all be all. I've had a lot of people on this platform that have talked about using a coping mechanism that has really helped them. And I think I really struggled with that concept when I first separated from the military because I thought that the only way to process things that have happened to you in your life is by like talking it out and like connecting dots and like learning from that situation. But I think what I've learned more recently is that we don't have to talk about or process every single thing that has happened to us in our life, that there are ways that we can cope with things and live with things because what happened doesn't go away,
Mhm.
right? And like I don't think personally, I don't think we need to talk about every single thing. I think if you can find something that works for you that helps you move through that, and
Mhm.
physical movement is like a wonderful way to do that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And so, anyway, that's just kind of my thoughts on what you said. Is there anything that like struck rung a bell or anything for you in your
Yeah,
head? I
I
want
mean,
to share.
honestly, there's like several things.
Yeah.
Like, and I agree. Like, we don't need, I'm not a talk therapy person. Like, and I've been told I probably should do it, but like, I just don't do it because I feel like my problems aren't as like bad, quote, quote, or worrisome as some people who are more traumatized because I do have that outlet. So I don't do talk therapy, but a lot of people do find really good like outcomes and realizations out of it. And, people who don't want to do it or don't want it on their record or whatever, like journal, like do some meditation, journal it out, write it out, work out, or like there's so many other ways to do it. And maybe try talk therapy and who knows, maybe you will enjoy it. But I was just never that person because, my family when we were younger, like had to go through a lot of therapy and I just never felt like my issues were big enough to be talked about. So it was just always for me, I just never felt like that. And then you just mentioned like how like the intel community because you were reconnaissance too. Like you see things on the daily basis. So it's almost like a mini deployment every day. So you're going to work, you're seeing some stuff, and then you're trying to switch your mindset from going to military mode, like quote quote deployed on station to going back home. And I know that was like a lot of issues too because like if you don't have that time to separate what you've seen at work, you could be bringing it home and, taking it out on family, friends, kids, whatever. So I know it was the topic when I was at Creech. So Creech is about 40 minutes north of Vegas. So there was only one straight road going to and from Vegas to Indiana Springs, which Creech was at. And people would say that was my time to decompress, to kind of separate the whole going to war mindset to, all right, now I'm going, it's a family life. And I think that's where a lot of people don't realize that either, just because, we're not like Intel's not deployed 6 months. I mean, some are, but like in my situation, we were considered deployed on station. So we did our job, we were quote, quote, deployed, then went home that night. And so you don't really have a lot of time to kind of switch your mindset. And for me, I never really had any regrets of the things that, I was a part of because of my situation with Zach. I was like, no, it's either them or us. Like that was always kind of how I separated it. But I know a lot of people who struggled with even just being, a possible person on the attack. And so the conscientious objectors, like that was like a big thing. And for me, I was like, how are you conscious about this? It's them or you. But
Yeah.
some people but for me, I had that background of like, it actually did happen to me. Like I lost someone because of this. Like, how many more people am I gonna lose if we don't take out, you know, the heads of the snake, if you will?
Yeah.
And so, a lot of people do struggle with that. Like even though I didn't have any regrets, I would have nightmares. And I would have like these reoccurring nightmares where terrorists were actually chasing me, my brother, and my sister. And and it always would end up me waking up when I would sacrifice myself to save my brother and my sister. And I would just have these reoccurring like nightmares all the time. And I would wake up and sweat. Like, obviously, my mind wasn't okay. Like, you don't just, I mean, right? Dreams are your subconscious trying to tell you
Right.
something. So I would have these reoccurring dreams, but again, I would never talk to anyone about it. But when I did get out of the military, like, they stopped. But I will say, when I did live in Vegas, it was also the same time when the Vegas shooting happened.
Mhm.
And, as intel, Vegas was always a hot spot for possible like terrorist attacks. So, as a briefer and an analyst, I'd always be telling the crew, I'd be like, guys, you have to watch out your back. Like, Al Qaeda is possibly, talking about attacking on this day, da da da. So, when the Vegas shooting happened, I was like, these fuckers did it. Like, they finally did it. And then it comes to find out it was the homegrown. We still don't even know the motive for that attack, but after that incident, it re-triggered a lot of my PTSD from the situation and I had the nightmares. And it was very hard for me to like deal with that situation because I was heading towards the strip when it happened, but then there was like a huge traffic jam. So then I ended up going home. So then I was like, why didn't I go back and try to help people? So like that mentality of like that military going towards the action, and I didn't do that. So then I was like, am I a fraud? Like, why didn't I do that? And that was another thing I also really struggled with too, mentally. And so, like, that attack really kind of set me back on like trying to figure out how to cope with something that just hit so close to home.
Yeah. Yeah. Moral injury, I've heard, is a huge thing, especially in the intel community. I think it's being talked about more in the military veteran community, just in general, as people that really struggled with that like moral side of things of did I do the right thing in several different scenarios. And so I think that's kind of a newer topic of discussion on the mental health side of things. And it's interesting to me to hear how people cope or justify or allow themselves to do the job in the military. Some people are more okay with things than other things. Some people really struggle with things. Everyone copes differently. And that's kind of why I say, like, you find what works for you when it comes to your coping. And they think that different things work for us at different points in our lives too. So, talk therapy might not be your thing now. Maybe 20 years down the road, it will be, maybe not. I think that it's okay to figure out what works for us in that season of our life. And if that's what is helping us get through, then that's fine. Because also the wrong thing at the wrong time can be damaging too. So there's two
Mhm.
sides to the spectrum there. I did want to get a little bit more into talking about the woman side of things as
Mhm.
a veteran or as an active duty service member. Obviously, you have a passion for women's stories in the military, i.e., with your podcast platform. Was there something specific in your experience that really fueled that passion for women of the military, or what? I guess what led you to that passion and the platform that you have now?
Yeah. So, like I said before, like I met my husband in the military. We actually joined on the same exact day. So we like were through it together. We were the same rank, same stuff, whatever. And I would get so fucking annoyed that people would thank him. We would both have our IDs. They would thank him and then not say anything to me. He got upgraded to first class on a flight and I didn't, which I mean, I'm just annoyed because they didn't recognize my service.
Disgruntled.
Yeah, I was just like a little disgruntled. I mean, my
Yeah.
husband didn't take it because he knew better. But like, I just remember like people would just always assume that my husband was, the military member. And yes, he was and is, but I was like, bitch, I serve too. Like I am serving. And I just remember there was one time I did hand my active duty ID to a woman and she looks at it, and if you look at the, military ID, it has your picture, it has your name, it says active duty.
Yeah.
And she looks at me, she's like, "Oh, your husband serves." And I was like, "Oh, okay." I was like, "Yeah, but so do I." And she was like, "Oh my God, really?" And I was like, "Oh, no, my gosh." And it drove me crazy that people could not like even fathom the fact that women could serve. And so I was just always like, women serve too, women serve too. And which is hence the name of my podcast, because, I just feel that a lot of women's service is just very kind of brushed to the side, or people would just assume you're the spouse. And I'm like, no, I did my time. I did the same exact thing, as some of these guys that are doing, but yet why am I being in the shadows? So my passion kind of just it was more because I was just really, really tired of people just assuming that I was just a spouse. And I was like, no, no, I'm not. And
Yeah.
that's actually one thing I told my husband. I was like, don't you ever assume that the woman, like, you better ask, like, are you in or is your husband?
Right.
Like, don't just
Yeah.
assume that it's the husband. And that's essentially where it all started.
Some of the best platforms get started out of rage. So that's how my platform started too. So I can't judge. But yeah, I mean, even I these days, like I don't even assume that a man served in the military because I've met a lot of men and I live in a military community.
Mhm.
I've met a lot of men who I'm like, are you a veteran? No. Oh, okay. Well, some people would assume you are. People assume my husband is. He's not because he has a beard and, I'm the woman and we're in a military town and, you know how it is.
Yeah,
But
it's the assumptions, and that
yeah,
drove me crazy.
yeah, it's wild. It's almost 2025 when this episode releases. It will be 2025. And people still can't wrap their mind around women serving in the military. And it's been quite some time now. But yeah, I love that you've created a platform to amplify the voices of women who are serving and women veterans because there are so many women out there who have gone through so much just to, I guess, fight for a spot. And
Mhm.
I don't know, did feel like it's somewhat of an even playing field. I know there's like a whole huge conversation in the world surrounding equality and stuff, and I'm not going to get into all that, but there's still stigmas that exist for women in the military and women veterans too. So appreciate what you do there. I did
Oh,
want to
thank
give
you.
you some time to talk about what you are currently doing now. I know you kind of like touched on it in the beginning, but with all the things that you are doing now, and then let us know how we can find you and how we can support you.
Yeah, so right now I am going to school for physical therapy. I think it's just like the next level of being like a fitness coach, right? But this time actually helping people. Well, not actually, I was already helping people, but like help them in more of a, like get better type of sense, like through injuries and stuff. So I'm getting my, doctorate of physical therapy. I'll graduate next December. Thank God I'm ready. And I was trying to aspire to be a sports physical therapist. I tell people all the time, like I'm trying to get into the Bears, the Chicago Bears, even though we suck. Locker room. Like that's I would love to work for an NFL team, but I'm actually, thinking about possibly going back into the military as a PT, finishing up the 12 years so I could get that pension. And then I'm just kind of sticking like spaghetti on the walls and seeing what sticks. But because, I did have postpartum depression and I was on medication. I'm off of it now, but trying to come back into the military with that, I will tell you, has been a huge obstacle. So who
Really
knows? Yeah, I
interesting.
can't tell you. I have to get waivers and then it's just been a hot mess as far as trying to get your mental health records and stuff like that. So I don't know.
Hmm.
It's an obstacle. And I think going back to kind of what I was saying, no one wants it on the record because of the
Mm.
shit that I'm trying to overcome right now. So we'll see what happens, but I'm trying to either come back in or work for, a sports team as a physical therapist. But essentially, I just want to help people, move better, live better, especially with all the injuries that the veteran community tends to have. I feel like I'll have a good population
Yeah.
clientele.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that you are running into roadblocks getting back into the military after getting support for mental health being
Hmm.
out of the military, because I feel like the military tries to portray something different. And so it's always interesting for me to hear like, no, this is how it actually is versus what they're saying, because
Yeah.
it's one of like the missions of this podcast, right? Is to change the culture of mental health within the DoD organizations. And so how are we supposed to break a stigma about mental health when we are straight up telling people like, oh, you got help at one point
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you're okay now, but like at one point you got help. So I don't know if we can trust you because, but I've seen
Hmm.
people with other things that I think they shouldn't have gotten to the military with on their records. And they're like, yeah, waiver, no big
Yeah,
deal.
and it's just so crazy. And mine was just like postpartum depression.
Yeah.
And it was just a cycle of getting through the hump of 6 months and then I
Yeah.
was off of medication.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just been a struggle. And, hopefully it's something that we could continue to kind of debunk because the stigma is still there, but just because you need like medication to get through a hump or just to even talk to someone doesn't mean that you're fucking crazy.
Right. And you can serve in the military on medication. I mean, I was on Zoloft for 2 years when
Hmm.
I was active duty, and I held a top secret security clearance when I was in. And I mean, I know it's different for everyone. I've heard so many different stories. So, that's the shitty thing is, you said you knew someone that got kicked out for just trying to talk to someone. I think it really depends on who you talk to
Yeah.
and what they do with the information that you give them. But it's
Hmm.
just unfortunate to hear that, there's all these talks about a positive trajectory for mental health when it comes to the military, and we're still giving people grief for postpartum depression
Hmm.
treatment. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out because hearing stuff like that irritates the shit out of me
Oh yeah,
because it
yeah.
should
It
not be that way.
irritates me too because I'm like, I'm not crazy. I
Yeah.
promise.
Right, right. And like that shouldn't even be like a thought that crosses anyone's mind, honestly, because we
Hmm.
all deal with mental health
Yeah.
ups and downs, and mental health isn't even a bad thing. I think, I'm gonna go on a mini tangent here for a minute. But when I say mental health to someone, their brain usually automatically goes to like negative. I've heard people even say like, oh, mental health, and like that the word mental health they're using
Hmm.
in like a negative part of a sentence. And I'm like, but your mental health it's everything, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like your physical health, right? When I hear physical health or wellness or well-being, most people aren't thinking like, oh, physical health, did you break your leg? Like, no, they're thinking like
Mm.
you went to the gym or you did something
Yeah.
positive for your body. And so I wish that mental health was the same way, but I hope that you can get through all that stuff because it shouldn't be that way. And it's ridiculous that it is. But I know anyway, so with your podcast and your personal stuff, what are your platforms? How can we best support you?
Yeah. So my podcast, Women Serve Too, you can search it on Spotify, or all major platforms, podcast platforms. Women serve too. Pretty simple. You can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram. Brittinie Wick or Brittinie Wick underscore fitness is my handle on IG. I will say my name is spelt weird. So it is Brittine and then Wick like John Wick, since everyone wants to make that joke.
Good
So,
one.
yeah, Brittinie Wick, come find me. I would love to connect and love to hear if anyone wants to be, a guest on my podcast. I would love to have you as well. Because like we said earlier, I'm just trying to amplify the voices of, women in the military because, hey, we did serve too. We did our time.
Awesome. Well, I will have all that stuff in the show notes for anyone that wants to support. Please do go support. Social media following is free, interacting is free, and it doesn't take a whole lot of effort. So please go make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to update your information as long as you let us know,
Oh,
Brittinie,
yeah.
about the things you're doing in the future once the spaghetti sticks on the wall, and if you need any additional support, that will always remain updated in the show notes for anyone listening to this in the future. But Brittinie, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. You have an incredible story. I know we only heard a snippet of it, but I'm so excited to continue following your journey and everything that you're doing. I think you're incredibly inspiring with all the things that you have done and all the things that you continue to do in your life. Are there any last words or a piece of advice that you want to leave the listeners with today?
Yeah, first off, Rachel, I love everything that you're doing, especially with like the mental health. So thank you for letting me be a part of the podcast. One thing that you really said, and I really definitely want to hit home with is mental health is health. So you're right that a lot of people do put a negative connotation to mental health, but don't let that stop you from trying to find a way to cope with the bad days, the stressors, or whatever you're dealing with in life, because mental health is health. You have to approach, your health as a holistic approach, physical, mental, in so many different ways. So if you do need help, please don't like hesitate to get it. Don't think that, it doesn't matter, because it does. And if you don't want to do talk therapy, find a different way, because that's my major thing right now is mental health is health.
Thank you for taking the time to listen in today. With your support, we are able to increase awareness of the mental health issues affecting service members and veterans today, with the goal of creating positive change. If you got value from this episode, please take 30 seconds to subscribe and share this episode within your own network. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.